Welcome to Community Policy Speaks, our podcast here at the Community Policy Forum. The Community Policy Forum is an independent think tank seeking to promote evidence-based and community-centered approaches to policymaking surrounding the structural inequalities facing Muslim communities here in the UK. We attempt this through connecting policymakers with academic research and experts, and through providing platforms for engagement with diverse Muslim voices on areas of contemporary importance. The Centre for Media Monitoring monitors the British media on how it reports on Islam and Muslims. Its aim is to promote fair, accurate, and responsible reporting by creating an evidence base, engaging constructively with key stakeholders, and empowering Muslim communities to engage more proactively with the media to change the current negative narrative. In March, CfMM launched its latest report examining the British media's coverage of the ongoing war in Gaza, in which, at the time of recording, almost 35,000 Palestinians have been killed, a majority of whom are women and children. And according to the UN, roughly 85% of the Gazan population has been internally displaced. To discuss this timely report, we're joined by Rizwana, Hamid, and Faisal Hanif. Rizwana is the director and advocacy lead of CfMM, engaging with key stakeholders, including regulators, editors, journalists, and politicians. She is an award-winning journalist and filmmaker with over 30 years working as a television producer-director, mostly for the BBC in news, current affairs, documentaries, and religious programming. Faisal is CfMM's media analyst and is responsible for monitoring, analysing, and producing CfMM's reports. He is a former Times reporter and BBC researcher, and has also worked for the Institute for Public Policy Research and the University of Oxford's Centre on Migration, Policy and Society. Thank you so much, Rizwana and Faisal, for giving up your time to join us today in order to discuss your report. So Faisal, I wanted to come to yourself first and just ask you to give a brief overview of the main findings of your report.
Thanks, Kazim. Thanks for having us. So in terms of the report itself, we established 20 statistical insights from both television broadcast coverage and online news coverage of Israel's war on Gaza. The statistical insights, I won't go through all of them, but they come under roughly around 6 themes, which we found encompass almost all of the media's coverage and approach in covering the events from 7th October onwards. So if I was to give you one of those, for example, is that 76% of the online news articles, they framed the current war as an Israel-Hamas war. And that's obviously a deliberate editorial position taken by individual newsrooms to label it as an Israel-Hamas war. But it is interesting that other broadcasters, other news agencies and online newspapers, etc., have labeled it as an Israel-Gaza war. So why is it that there's that differentiation, given that over 40,000 people have now been killed in Gaza by Israeli strikes, most of them women and children, and most of them civilians? Is it really fair to call it an Israel-Hamas war? Isn't that favoring one-side narrative? You know, the Israelis and pro-Israel supporters will no doubt want it to be referred to as an Israel-Hamas war as opposed to an Israel-Gaza war. That was one of the basic findings. Give you my quote-unquote favorite finding from the one that really stuck out at me was that in 98,500 mentions of the term Gaza, there were only 28 instances of the words occupied Gaza on broadcast TV channels. And 14 of them, so 50% of them were on the Al Jazeera English channel. So there seems to be this editorial decision of avoiding the fact and what is established British Western government policy and British government policy and position that Gaza is an occupied territory. And yet you wouldn't have found many mentions of that, if any, on a broadcast television channel. Now, why is that? Again, going to the idea of Israel's right to defend itself. You hear this phrase all the time: Israel's right to do this, Israel's right, etc. We found that that outnumbered the right of the Palestinians, or the mentions of the rights of the Palestinians, by a ratio of 5 to 1. So every 5 times somebody mentioned Israel's right, you only had one mention of the right of the Palestinians. Again, promoting a sort of one-sided narrative. Um, you know, 36% of the mentions of the right of the Palestinians again came from this one news channel, Al Jazeera English. So it was quite clear that Western broadcasters had a more biased approach to this in favor of the sort of Israeli position. We Lastly, I should mention that language was a really important one, because this is not something that uh, we only covered. There were other researchers and um, journalists within newsrooms have raised their voice about this. There was an infamous letter that was sent anonymously, I think, by internal BBC journalists to the head of the BBC. I forget the exact title of that position, but basically saying that there was a clear bias towards using emotive language when it came to the deaths of Israelis as opposed to the deaths of Palestinians. So when we looked at it, we found that Israelis were about 11 times more likely to be referred to as victims of attack compared to Palestinians. And in terms of broadcast TV clips, 2 out of every 3 emotive terms were used for Israeli death, and just 1 in 10 were used for Palestinian deaths. So if you take, for example, words like atrocities, slaughter, and massacre, over 70% of the terms of those 3 terms were used in reference to attacks against Israelis. Um, and when they were used in reference to Palestinians, they were often qualified with phrases such as what the Palestinians say is a massacre, what they say is a massacre. Now, arguably, that's the correct way of doing journalism, but it wasn't applied consistently. And a similar thing was going on in some sort of online news, where 68% of emotive terms were used to describe violence towards Israelis on 7th October. 33% of those were found on one news website, the Mail Online. Um, and there was other findings that have become quite infamous throughout this whole coverage. The unverified claims is a massive issue. Um, to this day, pro-Israel advocates and commentators talk about beheaded babies. Um, we found that there was 361 TV news clips where the terms beheaded and babies were found, and almost 50% of these were on 2 right-wing British news channels, quote-unquote news channels, Talk TV and GB News. So there's a clear sort of push of this information, which has been proven to be unverified and proven to be untrue, and yet we still get people mentioning the beheaded babies, um, which is a major editorial issue. So those are some of the findings, and not completely, but obviously anybody's welcome to look at the report, and all our sort of findings are at the front and easily accessible.
Thank you, Faisal. So, just staying with yourself, were there any patterns or trends in the way different media outlets covered events in Gaza and continue to cover events in Gaza? And do you feel that certain outlets are exhibiting more bias than others when it comes to the British media space?
Well, yeah, I mean, so just in case, in terms of the last statistics I gave you, 50% of the mentions of unverified claims from the first. So our statistics were based on 1 month, from 7th of October to the 7th of November. In that time period, I mean, 50% of unverified claims are found on 2 right-wing news channels. Um, and so there's quite clearly an approach on these channels, or quite clearly um, they invite the kind of people who are pro-Israel advocates and are pushing a certain narrative. Um, we At our launch event, we had somebody from Sky News who came and very kindly gave his time. Um, and he argued the point that he felt that um, labeling this as a Israel Hamas war was justified, because it allowed them to hold the Israelis to account for any failures. If the stated aim of Israel is to say that we are at war with Hamas and we want to get rid of Hamas, then anything less than that would allow a news station like Sky News and other news stations to hold them to account to say you have failed in your attempt. How convincing that argument is, I'm not too sure. I don't particularly buy it, but others may well do. Um, and yet, we see, for example, Al Jazeera, who traditionally have been described as promoting the voice of the global South, they've quite clearly taken a different approach. They quite clearly see this as a war on Gaza, and the statistics arguably would back them up because, like I said, tens of thousands, over 40,000, mainly civilians, have been killed, and that figure's likely to go up. Um, it's very transparent that there is, certainly from Western newspapers and broadcasters, there is a bias in favor of Israel, and it's quite transparent when you read certain Western newspapers. I mean, for example, the Telegraph, they make no bone about it. They're one of the other findings, which I didn't mention, was a total misrepresentation of pro-Palestinian protesters. Um, and again, two news channels, GB News and Talk TV, accounted for 42% of the mention or the references to protesters being quote unquote pro Hamas. The BBC had to apologize in one of its news clips for labeling protesters in London as pro Hamas protesters. And yet, in the right wing newspapers and the right wing news, you still get this narrative of, yeah, these guys, they don't really care about Palestine. What they're terrorist supporters and they're supporting Hamas. And if you are not supporting Israel by default, you are supporting Hamas. That seems to be the approach. So, some of, I mean, some newspapers and broadcasters are slightly careful about how they go about these using that kind of language, and others are openly um, pro-Israel in their stance and quite, quite open about labeling Palestinian protesters as terrorist sympathizers.
I'd just like to add something there, if you don't mind, Qasim, because I think what was really interesting in the first kind of few weeks, and we covered obviously the first month after October 7th, but it didn't really matter whether you were print or broadcast, whether you were left-leaning, right-leaning. Generally, there was a sense that media outlets were pushing a pro-Israeli narrative. And, what was surprising is even outlets like The Guardian or Channel 4, who you would normally expect to be a bit more robust in terms of their journalism and presenting a different perspective, even organizations like them in the first few weeks were reporting this as if 7th of October was ground zero. There was very little context that was being given around the whole war. Nothing to suggest that, this is a 75-year-old war that's been going on since the initial occupation. So I think it was across the board. And then the other thing was that certain newspapers who in the past, through our engagement with them, had been kind of turning a corner and beginning to approach their reporting on Muslims, Islams, migrants, their foreign coverage, seemed to take a complete U-turn, like the Express, for example, whereby it became one of the worst newspapers in terms of its front page headlines and really, really biased and kind of almost undoing all the good work that had been done. And I think the worst thing was that even with seasoned journalists, there seems to have been a sense of amnesia in terms of the historical context to the conflict. That's number one. And then two, a lack of challenge of the Israeli narrative in the first few weeks. There just seemed to be a fear, and that could have been because of the nature of the attack on the 7th of October, i.e., the scale of it, the magnitude, but also it was unprecedented, the number of people killed and the way that they were killed. So you can argue that it was such a big story. But I think they got stuck there. And then after that, they became very fearful of challenging the Israeli narrative one, either for fear of being, accused of minimizing what had happened on the 7th of October, or of anti-Semitism, or of, leaning towards a pro-Palestinian perspective. But we had so many examples of Israeli spokespeople, claiming so many things that were completely baseless, and yet that rigor just wasn't there in terms of actually questioning them and trying to corroborate those facts. And that was quite an alarming trend, I would say. For a journalist myself, that's what I kept thinking. Where is the context? And two, where is the journalistic rigor, even amongst correspondents who understand that region, who've been covering it, and therefore know that there's a broader context to this? I think things have changed subsequently, but that was certainly the case in the beginning.
Thank you, Rizwan. And that leads on really nicely to the next question that I had for yourself and that I also wanted to ask Faisal about as well. So, on the back of the report's launch at the beginning of March, and also looking back to October, it's been a number of months since then. Have you seen progress in the way that the war is being presented in the British media compared to October, November time?
So in terms of the coverage, I think it's broadly the same as what we found. Um, the Israeli position is quite often given priority. Um, we've seen examples of journalists who have attempted to hold Israeli politicians and pro-Israel advocates to account. Um, there seems to be, and this is not verified, but um, there seems to be a certain amount of silencing on them when it comes to them having challenged a particular position in a robust way. Um, the approach is pretty much the same. Israel is the good guy, and they are fighting terrorists, and this is war, and this is what happens in war. And if you look at the sort of the most recent coverage about the what's going on in America with the protests at the universities, um, you, the headlines across the board in newspapers, on broadcast television channels, they've again presented this as a sort of two-sided thing where the word clashes is a classic, which is always used in this conflict, um, where even at the university where Israel reporters wearing white masks were shown on video attacking pro-Palestinian um, protesters who had been sitting and protesting peacefully. Um, the headline were they didn't mention any of the attacks by pro-Israel protesters. They were very vague in the way they described what took place. Um, they often used the word violence in conjunction with Palestinian protesters. Um, so we see this same pattern of um, you know quote unquote vilifying those who protest or advocate for Palestine, and again presenting the Israelis as quote unquote the good guys. I mean, there's been a lack of coverage in terms of the I would argue the really racist and some would describe as fascist elements within the Israeli government. Some of the comments that have been made by Israeli ministers, etc., which are tantamount to calls of genocide against Palestinians, and some of them are. There's no other sort of interpretation you can give to them, and yet there hasn't been this overwhelming focus on this. And if you only have to go onto social media, and people on a daily basis will point out examples of deliberate or what can seem to be very deliberate misreporting. I'll give you one example to highlight this. There's an article in the Metro newspaper talking about well, after 6 months there's been there hasn't been any sort of development in the Israel Hamas sort of hope to try and establish a truce. something along those lines anyway, that the article was talking about. What the article did was it cited a poll that was taken at the onset of 7th October, following the attacks by Hamas, and then was taken again in February. And it was quite clear from the poll that the greater sympathy from the British public was towards the Palestinian side, which poll figures represented. And yet, the way it was presented in the article was to cherry pick certain figures to make it seem like Israel had the greater sympathy of the British public and the Palestinians had an increase in sympathy, but at a lower figure. And it wasn't clear to me why it was presented in that way. You had two figures that you could present as direct comparison, and yet for some strange reason they decided to cherry pick figure from the Palestinian, those who sympathize with Palestine, make it seem as if support for Palestinians was far less than support for Israelis. And that's a minor example, I would argue. Some of the major misrepresentation. I mean, you still get people talking about beheaded babies and all of these things that have subsequently come out and been disproved, not by Western media, but by Israeli media itself. Israeli media itself has done a lot of good work actually on this. It has to be said, compared with some of their Western counterparts who are continuing the misinformation and the misleading claims from earlier on.
I think just to acknowledge everything that Faisal said, but that within that, we have seen certain journalists become a lot more robust. So there's been examples of Krishnan Gurumati on Channel 4 really holding Israeli spokespeople to account, Michal Hussein on Today program as well. So we're beginning to see things like that. But overall, it's definitely still got a pro-Israeli bias. But also what's been interesting is that whereas, let's say, the BBC always used to refer as Hamas as, designated a terrorist organization by British government, you don't hear that often anymore. It might come in once in a while, but it's not being done as consistently as it was. In terms of referring to the Hamas-run Ministry of Health, you hear the Hamas-run less on broadcast media, and they're calling it the Gaza or Palestinian Ministry of Health. So there's chinks of it, but there's no consistency in that. And overall, there still is an unwillingness to kind of really present this story in a way that really highlights Israel as being, the aggressor and Palestinians as being the victim, whereas they have absolutely no problem in doing that when it comes to Russia and Ukraine. They've clearly labeled, the Russians there as the bad guys. And despite the growing evidence, even to the point of the International Court of Justice saying that there's plausible cause for that genocide is being committed and Netanyahu may be called up for war crimes, etc., and the amount of deaths and the underhanded ways and the blatant ways in which the Israeli Defense Force has misused their power to kind of assassinate and mutilate and kill civilians, and also what's going on in the West Bank now as far as the IDF is concerned, and allowing Israeli settlers and the brutality towards people in the West Bank. This whole picture, when you kind of say it, clearly shows who the aggressor is and who is in the wrong, but the media is still not reflecting that.
Thank you, Rizwana, and thank you, Faisal, as well. Faisal, I just wanted to come back to yourself and ask whether the findings of this particular report are similar to your overall research around the coverage of Muslims and Islam in the media.
In some ways, yes. We did a sort of 2-year study on the reporting on Muslims and Islam, which was released back in 2021, so quite a few years back now. And some themes emerged from there. I'll give you one of them. We found that, so we analyzed around 48,000 articles, online news articles. 2% of those were themed around anti-Semitism. What I mean by that is we looked at what the majority of the article was focused on. The 2% of all of those articles were, we felt, focused on the issue of anti-Semitism. When we came to looking at the worst examples, i.e., what we termed as the very biased articles, the ones that contravene most of our ratings, 4% overall were around the issue of anti-Semitism. So there was and what we found was that there was this deliberate push from certain elements in the media, and certain journalists, certain commentators, to try and link Muslims and Islam and Islamic belief with the issue of anti-Semitism, and the suggestions being that Muslims are anti-Semitic as a result of their religion. One of the themes we found, one of the themes we led on in the Gaza report was the issue of Islamophobia. When the October 7th attack took place, instantly you had editors of mainstream newspapers in this country on Twitter talking about Muslim fanatics and how Islam has contributed, or Islam contributes to the sort of bloodthirsty ideology of Hamas and things around and that sort of those sort of themes. And that discussion has continued within certain elements of the media, where there has been this sort of the attempt to deliberately link pro-Palestinian protests with and take it away from an issue of historical injustice and land and the rights of human beings, etc., and make it into a very sort of religious issue. I.e., the hatred for Israel comes from pure anti-Semitism, and that anti-Semitism comes from Islam and the beliefs that these people have. There's been a sort of deliberate stirring up of that narrative and promotion of the narrative. So, to some extent, it does mirror what we found in some of our previous research, but in other ways, it's actually a lot worse, because one of the things we found when I first started this work in 2018, there were some pretty bad examples in the media when it came to reporting on Muslims and Islam. And I have to say, in recent times, especially sort of pre-October 7th, in recent years, I think things weren't as bad. Maybe the focus wasn't on Muslims that much. Maybe other threats that had quote unquote other threats had sort of taken the media's attention away from this issue. But since 7th of October, there has been a real upscaling of mentions of Muslims and Islam, and the discussion, some of the discussions around the whole sort of what they would term as the Muslim issue, and you see that filtering into different topics now. Into take for example the election. Even today, there's a talk of Labour has been taken over by the Muslims, and there's a commentator on Talk TV today saying that Labour is now essentially an Islamic party. I don't know how the hell these people arrive at these conclusions. But that's the kind of narrative that's being built, and that has been sort of seen since post 7th of October. So a lot more work for us really to cover, unfortunately.
Thank you, Faisal. How can this report be used by activists and advocacy groups to hold journalists and media outlets to account for their coverage on Gaza?
I mean, I think the best thing about the report is that it provides evidence, and both qualitative and quantitative evidence of the scale of the bias and the misreporting that's been there. And so to use that as a basis on which to start engaging with editors and media outlets and holding them to account, but also in terms of identifying what we have highlighted to then submit complaints when you see similar things being, repeated and reported. I think it's very much a case of this isn't just Centre for Media Monitoring's job to be holding the media to account. Muslim organisations and activists across the board should be a lot more proactive in complaints. And I think the thing about complaints is that even though they may not lead to any changes, they are logged. And therefore, if we ever want to ask an organization, how many complaints did you have during your period of your coverage of Palestine or the Israel's war on Gaza, there's things that we can get from there to show how much people were complaining. So I think complaints are always an important thing to do. I think what we have done is obviously we've engaged with all the media outlets that we were previously engaging with. And it's a slow, hard process, I would say, because I think they do become quite defensive, even when you present them with the evidence. They can feel defensive, or they will come back to you and say, actually, we've had equal amounts of complaints from pro-Palestinian side as to the pro-Israeli side. So we must be doing something right, because we must be in the middle, because we're getting equal complaints from both sides. And I think that's a kind of a very lazy way of addressing what the issues are. But I think a lot of outlets have accepted that not providing a context at the beginning of the war was a shortcoming on their part. And we had the head of BBC's news content actually acknowledged that at our report launch in Parliament, where he said that, yes, they did feel that they didn't provide enough context and that more context could have been provided there. I think the lack of pro-Palestinian voices was also acknowledged, that they didn't have as many as they did as pro-Israeli voices, even though they argued that actually we couldn't find as many voices. But then if you look at Al Jazeera had lots of Palestinian voices from all over the world, as well as from the UK. So I don't think, again, that's an argument. But I think it's about also activists and Muslim communities putting up people who can go on television and can be called upon to comment on things if they are experts in this area. And so, we need to be a lot more proactive in how we engage with the media, how we get our voices heard on there, or how we get pro-Palestinian voices heard in the media. And then there's also, writing on other platforms, highlighting the shortcomings of mainstream media, using social media as a platform. And social media has been absolutely brilliant during this whole period in actually highlighting some of the most egregious, mistakes and bias that's been shown on mainstream media. And as Faisal was saying, in a way, investigative journalists and left-leaning Israeli journalists and media outlets have ended up doing a lot of the work that mainstream media should have been doing in terms of some of the investigations, or verifying certain things, or denouncing other claims that were being made. So I think for activists and people who are involved in advocacy, it's about holding the media to account, whether that's through complaints, whether that's through meetings, whether that's through presenting evidence to them. It's then about engaging with politicians that, also have an influence, and holding them to account or having meetings with them. And I think, it's been quite interesting when it's come to the domestic scene, that actually not just the media, but politicians have played a really, really divisive role. And we know the role that Suella Braverman played right from the beginning when it came to the pro-Palestinian protests, where in the beginning she firstly wanted to make carrying the Palestinian flag a criminal offence. She then had the huge onslaught onto the Metropolitan Police in terms of that they're not arresting enough people and they're not doing their job well enough. We had people like Lee Anderson. I mean, we had a whole array of politicians alongside the new kind of right-wing broadcasters that are on the media landscape, pushing very Islamophobic lines in terms of the framing, not just of the domestic side of this conflict, but also how it manifests itself in Palestine as well. And so I think holding politicians to account, continuing and going on the marches. A lot of people have used their vote as a way of protesting this time against politicians, but inadvertently, the media as well, and how these institutions of power use their power not to reflect the voice of the majority of the British public, which, as Faisal mentioned, a poll that's been done shows that the majority of British public have more of a pro-Palestinian sympathy, whereas you would never get that feeling if you were to listen to our politicians or the media. So I think it's about challenging on every single level, whatever means you can, whatever kind of organization you're in, find the ways and means to hold these institutions that hold power and yet are supposed to be representing us to actually start doing that.
Thank you, Rizwana. I actually think that's a brilliant point with which to end. We always try and end these podcast episodes on a somewhat positive and constructive note, which can be hard given the current political climate and given everything that's currently going on in Gaza. But I do commend yourself, Rizwana, yourself, Faisal, and all of your team at CfMM for the brilliant work that you've been doing. If you're listening to this podcast on YouTube, then the link will be available down below in the description to the report. Do check it out, and do check out CfMM's wider work, and do support the brilliant work that CfMM are doing. And also do follow Community Policy Forum across all social media channels to keep up with our work. And once again, Rizwan and Faisal, thank you so much for giving up your time for discussing this brilliant report with us today. And we hope to have you on again soon. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.